It's a real pleasure to welcome you all today to this kind of workshop on Caribbean sexualities at the University of Reading, which is obviously my home institution, because the work that I've been doing as part of this project or part of this thinking, which was sponsored by a very precious and treasured AHRC fellowship, has been something of a kind of roadshow. In other words, I've been kind of taking it everywhere else, but not really doing much here at Reading. And before I move into a kind of overview of how I've approached my work, I want to kind of acknowledge, and more than acknowledge, the fact that this work's developed through the opportunities that I've had to work with other scholars and activists in the Caribbean and the diaspora. I'm sure that all of you know that the question of diverse sexualities is pretty explosive material, and across the time that I've been working on this, there have been moments of seeming optimism, such as when Portia Simpson-Miller said that she would welcome gays into her cabinet, to moments of depression where she said actually it looks like the economy and questions of drugs and violence would come first, as if they ever wouldn't, and then moments of real kind of perhaps, extreme lows, such as the murder of Dwayne Jones, a cross-dressing 17-year-old party goer in St James, Jamaica on 22nd of July, that really kind of, made very visible to everyone who was thinking that maybe things were changing a little bit, that the threat is still extraordinarily severe. So the complexities that inform that situation of something like that very acute homophobic violence, and then the fact that there are also people in, Caribbean, in all Caribbean places that live, non-heteronormative lives, unremarkably negotiated within kind of, those social prohibitions in very ingenious and interesting ways. I think that the complexities that inform that situation have been really something that's engaged a lot of scholars, many of whom are here with us today, and a lot of writers, and to try and think about how to manoeuvre around what seems to be a very contradictory situation of a kind of global North media story of this kind of extremely, the most homophobic place on earth, and then these kinds of much more uneven realities, and the fact that, there is a lot of domestic resilience, a lot of people living their lives in different ways. And I guess one of the focuses on today, and coming from my own work, is what might come from creative writings, what literary worldings might mean for a reimagination of Caribbean sexualities. So in a minute I want to reflect on how my own work has developed a little bit, but I also want to explain the context of coming to those understandings collaboratively with Caribbean critics and writers and activists. So that began really when in 2010 I was successful in getting a very small pot of money from the British Academy for a project, an international collaboration with Evelyn O'Callaghan, a professor at University of West Indies, Cave Hill, Barbados. And we called that project Breaking Sexual Silences, not necessarily that would have been our choice, but we thought that the British Academy would probably choose that kind of, we would have liked to have called it something a little bit more about the kinds of the different wavelengths on which sexuality is already registering. And I guess two things were really striking about the events that followed from that. One was that we had a lecture theatre in the Arts Building on a Monday evening, and we were wondering whether, more than a handful of people would turn up. And when we got in there, the whole place was completely full. The Caribbean Broadcasting Company were there, several radio stations were there, and it just really registered how powerfully there was a kind of interest in hearing and listening as well, perhaps. And then the other thing that was really important about that event was that we gathered together academics and activists and NGOs to share kind of realities and possibilities. And there was literally a storming of that workshop by a student group who said, we need to be here, you need to listen to us, and we need to listen to you. And after that workshop, they actually went on to form an organisation called Code Red for Gender Justice, and have had a much more kind of, I'm not suggesting as a direct result of that, but I'm saying there was a kind of sense in which the student body really felt that they needed ownership of those discussions as well, and have set up a student organisation. And more recently, I'll just set this plain, more recently I organised an event in Trinidad, which was part of two really amazing collaborations between the international, the Institute for Gender Development Studies, the International Resource Network, and CAISO, which is the Coalition for Advocating for the Inclusion of Sexual Orientation, which is one of the main activist groups in Trinidad. And the first part of that collaboration was to work together on a critical sexuality short course. And that short course is sort of comes under the remit of the Caribbean IRM, which I'm sure many of you will know is a wonderful kind of resource network. And it was to develop a locally specific version of a Ford Foundation course on critical sexualities and sexuality studies. And the work that we did on that is at completely open access. So when any of you could go onto that and download it and use it to teach students anywhere. So the idea really is to try and create this kind of community of practice around different understandings of sexualities. And on that course there were graduate students, nurses, policemen, librarians, domestic violence support workers. So it was a really interesting to hear all of their engagements and perspectives as well. And the second, which was funded by the AHRC Fellowship, was still a collaboration between IGDS, IRN, CAISO and myself. And that grew to take the shape of 2 days of gathering amongst academics and students and activists. And lots of people as well, actually, who just came. We advertised it in the newspapers. And that was kind of sharing. We had a cultural evening where Colin Robinson did the most wonderful presentation on calypso and same-sex lives. And if any of you have not heard that, I would encourage you to go on YouTube and listen to it, because it's really brilliant. And people read a little bit from their work and talked about other work and read from other work. So it was really an opportunity for energising discussions about thinking and acting for change. We ended up producing this wall mural at a club called Bohemia. So we started off with a blank wall and people wrote quotations and testimonies. That's Shani Mutu's brother's testimony there. And it was a really genuinely very kind of stimulating and energising event. And I think that, again, one thing that was really important, not surprising to me, but important, was the level of sophisticated, thoughtful, kind of organised engagement with all of the theories and ideas and practices of sexuality studies that happen within the activist group. So it wasn't at all this kind of notion that the academics were there with all of their kind of sophisticated apparatus. There was a really challenging dialogue between those two. And I want to screen a little bit of Colin Robinson's talk explaining CAISO's remit in a little while. And then I guess that was particularly important, because when we're exposed from this situation of the UK, from the region, from the outside, some of that very kind of impressive, granulated thinking around sexuality doesn't really find a space to be communicated. So one of the aims of the workshop was to record all of these activists presenting their work and other academics and students from within the Caribbean, and to make that accessible, which it is via YouTube, so that we can all use that as a resource to sort of share with students. On Monday I go off to Jamaica to run a similar kind of 2 days of creative and critical thinking about sexual diversity. And I think some of the same tensions are arising, obviously, in the planning there between groups who think it's absolutely central still to emphasise the level of hatred, the level of violence, the level of kind of, discrimination and persecution that faces sexual subjects who don't fit into the national kind of category, and those who feel, on the other hand, that what's really important to emphasise is the lives that are lived in spite of all of that, the resilience, the hopefulness, the kind of joyfulness. And I know that Keon will be talking a little bit about that Jamaican situation. What the project's allowed me to do is to kind of learn a lot about just how complicated those issues are, and in many ways what that does is to make it harder and harder to write, because everything that you begin to say you realise is kind of inadequate to the complexity or of the situation, or the kind of the layering of different interests and audiences. So today's gathering obviously offers yet another opportunity to extend that dialogue, and one of the best things about having the fellowship money is that I've been able to invite the colleagues whose work I really admire, both critical and creative, and to ask them to present today. So I guess I'm just going to give a very brief overview of my own thinking in relation to that and how I've changed that thinking, and then play a little bit of Colin speaking before Keon presents. Obviously, given the urgency of these questions around discrimination and equal access to justice and constitutional recognition and citizenship, a lot of the questions around diversity kind of link into those issues. And therefore there has been this necessary focus on contesting homophobia, both politically, legally, culturally and theoretically. And there's been some, lots of really interesting work done on that. And another kind of open access resource that I would point everyone to is the IRN's Caribbean Homophobias project, which you can access online. And I guess that this kind of work has developed to show us how cultural productions and expressive culture can actually work in tandem with those legal, political projects. So, for example, in my own thinking, in a book that I published before, I kind of argued really how something like Patricia Powell's A Small Gathering of Bones allowed us to see the kind of fatal consequences of homophobia. So in that novel, the protagonist who is dying of AIDS actually doesn't die of AIDS, he dies by the abuse of his own mother, so that the novel is kind of showing us that the culture of homophobia is actually the kind of lethal culture. Or it can function as a lesson in empathetic identification, such as in Lawrence's Alred Sin, which delivers this kind of narrative journey through which heterosexual and homosexual brothers come to terms with their own and each other's sexuality. So it literally allows us to kind of enter this empathetic overcoming of prejudice. And it can also function, I think, just as a kind of expression of the legitimacy and the pleasure of same-sex desire. Some of the scenes in Dion Brown's Another Place Not Here, that sense of just the kind of fulfillment and pleasure of the experience. So I guess there has been quite a powerful and persuasive discourse emerging around the power of the literary to contest homophobia, and showing how literature responds to and supports assertions for that full recognition of equal humanity, entitlements and citizenship, which I'd see as a kind of extension of Caribbean criticism as a kind of rights-bearing discourse, as it helped the national struggle and it helped kind of, women's claims for visibility. And really what I've been trying to think about in this work is how to link my appreciation of all of those sorts of writings with my awareness that running throughout the Caribbean tradition is a much more interesting disruption, or not more interesting, but another interesting disruption of sexual governance and the kind of heterosexual imperative that kind of crops up in very, very unexpected places. And I guess what that made me really think about is that literature might offer us a valuable resource for a very kind of thorough rethinking about that understanding. So instead of just contesting homophobia, we actually contest the whole construction of this hetero-homo binary in the first place, and think about whether this our whole bearings on a kind of erotic repertoire need to be rethought. So in her 2009 essay, Caribbean Sexuality Mapping the Field, Kamala Kempatu, who's obviously a leading scholar of sexuality studies, offers this very comprehensive literature review, and her conclusion is that for sexuality to be a vantage point for Caribbean research and study, the current complexities need to be acknowledged and the intricacies of a range of sexual arrangements and practices appreciated. And one of the obstacles really to making that acknowledgement possible that Kempadu hints at is that we're tied into this understanding of sexuality as identity bearing, as object orientated, either hetero or homo. And she draws attention to the way in which she says the specification of sexual identity groups often elides the very varied sexual arrangements in the region, and calls for attention to be paid to, this is another quotation, how sexuality is expressed or practiced, not the way in which sex bodies or sexualities are constituted or determined. And that's been a really kind of important thing for influencing how I've been trying to think about my work, in trying to bring together this remarkable body of literary works that very much address that very variegated sexual arrangements and expressions of kind of multiple overlapping sexual practices that Kempadu recognises. And thinking about literature really then as a tool to contest Caribbean heteronormativity rather than simply the homophobia. For thinking that while heteronormativity remains unchallenged, the kind of unmarked norms sort of akin to whiteness or masculinity, that our kind of possibilities for really transformative understanding of sexual inclusion probably can't take place. So that's kind of really where I'm coming from kind of theoretically, and trying to think about these works in a slightly different relationship to an idea of Caribbeanness, and really thinking about the fact that the Caribbean is widely acknowledged and even celebrated as a place that's made possible new ways of experiencing culture, new ways of theorising identities, you know, as syncretic, hybrid, creolised. And the material basis for that, you know, the very deconstructive force of the historical situation, that kind of unrivaled velocity of global compression. And yet at the same time meeting this kind of context in which the newness, the liquidity, the differently known differences somehow, you know, reach a limit point to understandings of sexuality. And there's therefore this kind of mismatch which, you know, Kempadu is identifying between the kind of narrow offer that ways of thinking has to bring and the kind of very broad repertoire of lived possibilities. And I guess I'm trying to think about the way in which we could use literature as a point, an opening up, a kind of interlocutor between those two realities to make one visible to the other. And to think that that situation around the kind of failure to extend Caribbeanness and what's celebrated as Caribbeanness into a kind of understanding of sexualities is actually a kind of conceptual anomaly that we can overcome. And, you know, there's lots of ways in which that might be overcome. And I guess you know, that the people presenting today will all have slightly different ways. And my contribution really to this is to try and think about that fundamental anomaly within Caribbean studies, and to think about the fact that while Caribbean people and Caribbean studies have found significant creative and ethical value in all of the disruptions of binaries in relation to racial, cultural, linguistic identities and practice, that sort of same investment in a creolised formation of a very cherished plasticity kind of ends at sexuality only in the kind of transcription rather than in the actuality. And so I've chosen to kind of draw on queer commentary to think about the Caribbean region, and I guess to be deliberately kind of be provocative and brush against the idea by thinking about the Caribbean as a queer place, by trying to think about the fact that taking a concept like genderqueer and then thinking that culture queer might be a good descriptive term for the Caribbean in terms of its cultural formation. And once we can start thinking about culture queerness as being something that's already affirmed and validated and celebrated, then somehow the move or the shift or the distance or the thinning of the membrane between culture and queerness can then kind of take place. So I'm not going to go into the whole arguments about whether or whether not to use that term queer and the problems of that term. It's not that I'm avoiding them. I will go into them if you want me to. I'm just trying to be kind of brief. And I guess what I'm really trying to claim is that queer commentary is a kind of Caribbean epistemology by nature, if not by name. And actually, it's a way in which queerness can seem to be entirely natural to the Caribbean rather than this kind of, unnatural presence. It can seem to be like the most kind of natural to a Caribbean matrix that has this kind of insistence on multiple possibilities jostling without kind of, singular resolve. And to make those kind of seemingly irreconcilable family members, Caribbean and queerness, to show actually how, certainly within literary works, they're already incredibly close relations and they're already mapped within the same kind of kinship networks. So what I try and do in this book is read across, this study, which is really not quite a book yet, is to read across a range of works. So something like looking at the kind of refusal to choose that happens in Andrew Salker's Escape to an Autumn Pavement, where he just simply refuses to choose between hetero and homo alternatives. And he says, no one understands my sort of freedom. He's kind of tracing that refusal back to a very Caribbeanness. Alongside something like Shani Muti's Valmiki's Daughter, which is trying to look at the internal queerness to institutions such as marriage, and works that have been, very critically acclaimed, works that have come from LGBT writers, and works that have come from so-called kind of, extraordinarily kind of heteronormative works like Oscar Wilde, which seems to me to be a very, very queer novel. And to try and, instead of offering this kind of trajectory of works that move with that rights-bearing discourse, not because I don't think it's important, but I think quite a lot of that's going on, to try and think instead, really, how do we account for and how do we begin to use what I see as a very deep entanglement and a deep intimacy within Caribbean literature between that sort of condition of culture queerness, where seeming and being don't answer to those cores of origin and ethnicity, they're not about singularity, and the accepted resistance to sexual norms that seems to me all over Caribbean writing. And, even I've done a piece, and I know Lawrence and I disagree slightly on, but a piece about Naipaul's Away in the World, where the Naipaul uses this Leonard Side figure, who's a decorator of cakes and arranger of flowers, a figure of demonstrably indeterminate gender and sexuality, who becomes a very powerful figure of identification for Naipaul with his own Trinidadianness, so that at one point the narrative says, all Leonard Side would have known of himself and of his ancestors would have been what he had awakened to in his mother's house in St. James. In that, he was like the rest of us. So this kind of way in which his indeterminacy offers a kind of entry point for talking about Caribbeanness, and to ask what it means that Naipaul turns to side to understand himself, but also what it means that Naipaul can make that kind of philosophical gesture of co-belonging. and which is published in 1994, the very year that Jackie Alexander publishes her searing critique of the non-philosophical, the actual lived reality of being a queer subject in Trinidad, in which she says it's not just anybody can be a citizen, that very famous bit, in which she actually says, I'm an outlaw in my own country. So I guess that it's in trying to think about those, to make visible these philosophical connections through literature is one thing, but then to think, what can we do with that? What does it mean to us, and how can it be of value in trying to think differently about this what I call anomaly, but this kind of sticking point within theorizations of Caribbeanness, or a kind of block. And I guess that's why it seems to me so important to think about, the fact, obviously my work is, purely academic, has an academic audience, but it's been very interesting for me to be able to learn from and think about the way in which the activists working in the Caribbean are also trying to negotiate some of these very kind of complicated, big theoretical ideas, and then the implementation of actually how to work out what actually might make a difference to people facing that everyday discrimination. And I just want to turn now and play you a bit of Colin talking about this in a presentation that he gave at the event. Oops, oh dear, I've just shut him down somewhere. Okay. Oh, sorry.
Some of the thinking that we've done in engaging in politics around sexuality, sexual diversity, gender diversity, in that framework. Yes, sir? So I'm going to run through a few things and spend a little time at the end talking about a revitalized regional formation. So, I think other folks have made these points that politics are about values, they're about a particular analysis, they're about issues of difference and power, and in LGBTI work, how we understand that power, how we critique that power, and how we engage with power and change are critical questions. Kaito formulated when we began to respond to the visit of an ex-gay ministry from California, what we stood for, because we wanted to educate and mobilize people who were involved in that response. And we began developing these 10 ideas that we've refined since. And we call our values. And the first of all is that you have to understand the world in order to change it. That you have to have analysis and strategy and not do activism by VAPs. We had a training called I Am a Citizen at the end of last year, and people said, we want to inflect that a little bit and we want to talk about the value of intuition in addition to analysis. The work we're doing is indigenous and it's imaginative and it's unorthodox and it's not replicating the work that comes to us from the North. That nationalism and nation building are a core part of how we engage. That we want to build a nation, we must participate in a nation, and that we must participate politically, including participating in political parties, because that's how politics happens. And sexuality is precious and essential and part of human dignity, and so is gender. That we own our own bodies, and Christophe talks about this notion of sexual citizenship. This is a very interesting and potentially controversial thing, that rather than rejecting this notion that faith and sexuality are in conflict, that many LGBTI people are people of faith, and that faith can be a tool both for oppression and for liberation. That we share things in common with other people who are not LGBTI. Some people actually thought we were homophobic and then got angry with us because they thought we were, and then told us they were going to meet their girlfriend later. So, and there were 6 key issues we imagined a government would do in 6 months. Well, we learned some political lessons. We focused on government leadership and building government capacity. The notion of simply speaking out, speaking up on these issues. The notion of the governments, despite political will, have to build capacity. That we wanted to put a desk in the gender ministry. We wanted sexual orientation and gender identity to be mainstreamed in training across the public service and in initiatives like masculinities and gender-based violence. But ultimately, that research and public debate and building technical capacity is key to this work. We had one legislative priority, which was what we thought was the easiest thing to do, around which there was broad political consensus and which wouldn't take political risk, and that was adding sexual orientation to the discrimination protections of the Equal Opportunity Act. We initially talked about other issues as a package, and we settled on a different package after 2010, which is the notion of adding AIDS and HIV at the same time, because a human rights review of Trinidad and Tobago shortly after the EOA passed said these were the 3 things that were missing, and the government has introduced legislation to add the 2 and not sexual orientation. We talked a lot about social vulnerability, and that as an opening to highlight how a government can take leadership and initiative in ways that make these issues palatable, and we use it as a strategy. We recognize that talking about rights isn't always helpful, and often talking about social vulnerability is a way for a state to actually feel that it can act. And we talked about crime and policing, and ways in which sensitizing police so that we're getting the same standard of access to justice, the same kinds of treatment, and not being called bullerman when we go to report bias violence in a police station. We've talked repeatedly about how bullying and education and discrimination in employment and family violence and sexual abuse in children's homes and a range of issues come together to fuel homelessness among young trans and gay and lesbian people, and that there needs to be a strategic intervention to deal with those issues. And we talked about some broader initiatives related to that upstream from the homelessness. We talked about the education sector, and we talked both about dealing with bullying in schools as well as using schools as sites of developing notions of citizenship that were about inclusion and teaching diverse masculinities, about male underachievement being driven by homophobia in schools. And we talked about preparing teachers to teach both about tolerance, but also helping them deal with competent education around sexuality and dealing with their own faith struggles. What are we doing? We started doing policy work primarily, and we reformulated our mission very recently into these 4 frames. One, dealing with discourse and consciousness, which is one of the things we think we've been most effective at doing. Having a discourse and showing up in public conversations in a way that transforms people's imagination around sexual diversity and gender diversity, but also working on intersectionalities with other people who are working on rights and justice and nation building. We've recently undertaken a big initiative around regional and global South alliance building work.
I'm going to leave it there, but I think that gives you a kind of sense of the intricacy and kind of density of the thinking and acting that Kaiser are involved in, and the kind of very, very different view from the inside to a kind of, sense of a kind of some of the very blunt responses from the global north to kind of the homophobia of the Caribbean, just kind of what a different level of engagement that perspective offers. I'm going to ask Keon now if he would like to come and present.